This next lesson is about nationalism in Asia. This is chapter 25, section 2. The first question that I would like for you to answer in this lesson is a review question, and it is, what were positive and negative effects of British imperialism in India? Now, some of you wrote your effects of imperialism essay on this topic, and many of you argued that there were more positive effects than negative effects. Think about the effects that the British had on, think about what they built, think about the economy practices that they ended in India, and then you can also think about the political effects that they had. So take a moment to jot down what you remember about the effects. And again, we'll be covering those in class tomorrow. Now, to discuss the effects of World War I on India. So India, of course, was a British colony. They were considered the crown jewel. One of the effects is that the Indian princes actually helped support the British war effort monetarily, and also they provided the British with raw materials. So they supported the war effort with money as well as materials for the British soldiers. Something else that we see is there were Indian soldiers that actually fought on behalf of the Allied powers in East Africa as well as in the Middle East. Another effect of World War I is we see a rise in prices of food. This is because the Europeans were, all the food and supplies and resources were going toward the war effort, so it was just a problem of not having enough food for the Africans to purchase and consume as well. Something else we see is a decline in trade, again because the European powers were so focused on the war effort, they were not as concerned with engaging in trade. And this is another one of the negative effects, maybe you already mentioned it in the review question, is when the British came, they went and destroyed Indian industry, so specifically the textile industry. And during this time, the industries continued producing goods for the war effort, but those goods and the profit made from those did not benefit the Indian people. Instead, it benefited the European bosses who ran those industries. Now, we've briefly talked about the movement for Indian independence, and we mentioned how this was a nonviolent movement, and it was led by Mohandas or Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma actually means great soul or great teacher. And the method that he used was something called civil disobedience. And so this is not obeying laws that one believes to be unfair. So we're going to be watching a couple scenes from the movie Gandhi, and in one of the scenes it relates to the salt tax that was put on Indian salt, and they were no longer able to produce their own salt. And so the Indian people marched against this tax. So they refused to obey it because they didn't think that it was fair. Next, what we see is I'm going to go through a little timeline of some factors leading up to this nationalist movement for independence. So in 1919, one of the incidents was the British actually killed unarmed protesters in the city of Armistar. So you can imagine how that would fuel the nationalist fire. The British people killing innocent protesters who were protesting British rule. Next, in 1930, this is where we see the Salt March that I just mentioned. And what's interesting in studying this case is to think about how it parallels the American experience and the way that the British taxed common everyday goods like playing cards and dice and legal documents and things. Obviously, this is much later, but in this incident, the British increased the salt tax and they prohibited people from harvesting and making their own salt. And so what we see is Gandhi led this protest where they actually marched to the sea, and then he harvested his own salt, which was against the law at that time. And then in 1935, we do see some progress, some compromise by the British government. They passed what's called the Government of India Act, and it's going to give a small portion of the population the right to vote. So not everyone by any means has the right to vote, but they are opening those doors. And the big thing that this conflict arises is whether or not this whole movement for independence. In India, they have majority religions of Hinduism. They have a large Muslim population, and so the question about this movement is, should it be primarily based on Muslim faith? Should it be based on the Hindu faith? Should it be secular, which means not religious? Should it be based on traditional Indian values? Should it be based on the Western values of Great Britain? There were a lot of questions over what form it should take. And it's in 1947 that India gets its independence. And then in 1948, Gandhi is assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. The next thing that we're going to look at is Japan. And where we left Japan in our last unit is that Japan had previously been very isolationist. The US brought them out of isolation, and under the Meiji, the Japanese became more modernized, they became industrialized, they modeled their institutions after the West, so education, government, things like that. And then they also became imperialist, meaning they started going out to conquer other territories so that they could get other resources. Now, another effect of this time on Japan is during the Great Depression, we see Japan make more changes. So they actually become more militaristic and self-reliant, meaning they can't they're not engaging in as much trade because, as we mentioned before, with a world economy, countries are connected in trade. The Great Depression affected the world economy, all the countries that are connected in trade. So they saw that if they relied on themselves, they wouldn't be affected by the negative economic downturn that's happening worldwide. So as part of becoming more militaristic, they passed a military draft law. The economy was put under the control of the government, and this is common in other countries we studied, Italy, Germany, Russia. We see the government getting more and more powerful. Also, we see labor unions disbanded, so this organization can no longer speak on behalf of the workers. Then we see turning away from Western ideals and a more focus on traditional Japanese values. Lastly, then this is just very, very brief. We see nationalism and revolution rising up in other parts of Asia. For example, the communists in Vietnam are under the control and leadership of Ho Chi Minh. And there's also, we see that we've studied, and we're going to look at it again, the communist revolution going on in China. And so there's just a lot of changes going on in Asia. And with communism, this is appealing to the masses because it is arguing in favor of government control and government distribution of resources. so that all people have access during these difficult economic times.